Good morning, everyone. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online. We continue to be gathering folks in here. Hi, Brian. I have the recording going. As opposed to what occurred last week, I did post a summary of some of the material covered. I recorded that for use on our website as well. But very, very glad to have you all with us this morning. All right. Get us all going here. Last week, we were looking at the Gospel of Mark, and I was encouraging you to look at Mark on its own terms rather than through the lens of later Christianity, the lens of our particular views of Jesus. Mark has a rather distinctive and rather surprising kind of view. We underscored last week that Mark's gospel was written for an audience that was suffering. And in Mark's gospel, this gospel ends up focusing on Jesus' own suffering and death. That becomes the key for understanding Jesus. According to Mark, if you try understanding Jesus on the basis of his miracle activity, if you try understanding Jesus on the basis of particular titles that he's called, you're simply going to misunderstand Jesus unless you understand all of that material through Jesus' own suffering and death. Mark's gospel ends in a very surprising way. At the empty tomb, a young man encounters the women, and the young man announces that Jesus, the crucified one that they were seeking, is not here. He has been raised. Go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going into Galilee before you. There you will see him, just as he told you. The women fled with fear and trembling from the tomb, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Period. The end. That's not the way we normally talk about the story of Jesus. But that's what we were looking at last week. This week, we look at the Gospel of Matthew, and we find that Matthew includes about 95% of what the Gospel of Mark has, but it adds another 60% or so onto that. And a couple sessions ago, I had mentioned this two-source theory that roughly 90% of New Testament scholars agree with, that say that Matthew was using the Gospel of Mark as a source, that Matthew used another source that for convenience is simply called Q, the synoptic saying source, and then there are also materials that are unique to Matthew, and those three sets of materials are the ones that that Matthew draws on for dealing with Matthew's own gospel. Now, one could one could talk about the variety of reasons for why scholars think that Matthew is drawing from Mark, as opposed to Mark being a condensation of Matthew. One of the shortest reasons for that, there are a whole bunch of reasons, but one of the shortest is that it's far easier to understand Matthew being an expansion of Mark, rather than understanding why Mark would have gotten rid of stuff that Matthew has, including such things as the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer. Mark has none of that stuff. And so this whole idea that Mark was a gospel, the first gospel to be written, that had its own unique characteristics, but there were other Christians in the first century who weren't particularly satisfied with what Mark had, and therefore these other gospel writers made changes in that. And they made changes particularly to speak to the situation of their own audiences. So using this particular theory, we're going to first take a look at some of the changes that Matthew made to Mark's own gospel. Mark's gospel has a lot of action in it. It has some teachings, but frankly, they're rather sparse. Mark talks about Jesus as a teacher, but really contains very little in terms of teachings. Mark's story goes from the point of John the Baptist's activity and Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist, all the way to the empty tomb and the announcement by the young man there. In other words, it goes from basically Jesus' call to ministry and ends with an announcement of his resurrection, but nothing beyond that announcement. Throughout Mark is emphasizing Jesus' passion, his suffering, his death. So Matthew takes Mark's gospel and is going to use Matthew's going to use Mark's storyline, and basically is going to pull Mark's story apart. Going to take the actions, spread them out a bit, and then is going to insert 5 chunks of teaching materials. So the things listed as N on the screen. These are blocks of narrative that are mostly actions. They contain stories of Jesus' miracles, other things that Mark had talked about. But into that series of actions, Matthew inserts these 5 chunks of teaching materials. And in effect, this provides 5 different sermons. Now, we can automatically recognize that this is an artificial way of Matthew trying to present in a very short amount of space. Okay, Matthew's gospel can be read in about 2¼ hours, read aloud. Okay, Jesus' entire life is summarized in that brief period of time. And did Jesus talk about particular things more than once? I assume so. But no, Matthew has Jesus just giving 5 different sermons. And what Matthew has done is just collect various teaching materials, put it all together in a concentrated form as just a convenient way of conveying to other people what Jesus taught. Most of these teaching materials are from his Q source, the sayings source. Q is mostly just sayings of Jesus, includes parables, other stories of quick one-liners that Jesus has. Matthew has these things gathered together as sermons. And Matthew has some unique materials that have been combined in. Where Mark had teaching material kind of scattered throughout, Matthew takes Mark's material and sticks that in these various places, in these various sermons, so that you have all of that together. Each of these sermons has a very distinct beginning. They usually begin with something like, Jesus began to teach them saying, and then at the end, when Jesus had finished all these words, and then it launches back into another chunk of narrative, a bunch of actions. So in Matthew's structure, a key way in which it is distinguished from Gospel of Mark is that Matthew has these blocks of narrative, of action material, alternating with teaching. Action, teaching, action, teaching, action, teaching, action, teaching. And then moving into the Passion story. Well, Matthew's not done in terms of making changes to his Mark source at this point. Matthew then adds two more sets of material. At the beginning, has a genealogy and a birth story of Jesus and events around the time of Jesus' birth. At the other end, Matthew makes adjustments and changes, strikingly changes, the statement that the women said nothing to anyone. Matthew says that the women left, and Matthew includes a resurrection appearance story to the women as they are leaving the tomb. But somewhat strangely, when the resurrected Jesus speaks to the women, he basically repeats what, instead of a young man said at the empty tomb, Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, simply repeats what the angel of the Lord said at the empty tomb. And the women pass on their message. And yes, the 12, or actually the 11, the disciples minus Jesus, or minus Judas, end up meeting on a mountaintop in Galilee. And the Gospel of Matthew climaxes with what is often called the Great Commission. The resurrected Jesus speaks to the 11 and gives them a particular charge. And then the end. Nothing is said about what additionally occurred. That's the end of Matthew's gospel, climaxing with the words in that. In fact, I think I have, yes, this is the concluding part of Matthew. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all. Greek, the word is Gentiles. To all Gentiles, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and and of the Holy Spirit, in teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. That's a rather striking ending to Matthew's Gospel. I'd like to pause at this point and deal with your input and the input of those of you who are online, dealing with these questions on the theme. What's the purpose of Matthew's additions to Mark's Gospel? How do they change Mark's message? And let me just pop out of this so we have access to being able to see everybody who's joining us from by Zoom. But why do we have these changes? What difference do these changes make?
You've got the Great Commission at the end, and these changes give them what they need to teach the people, not just the life story of Jesus, but also what he told them about and his teachings. They gave them sermons.
Okay. Yes, we have the marching orders for the disciples, and there are specific things that are being taught. Teach them to observe everything I've commanded you. And so the 11 are being specifically presented as people who are to be sharing the message. Now, I want to point out a major shift that has occurred here compared to what was in Mark. As we go through the Gospel of Mark, the 12 are dumb as doornails. I mean, they pick up absolutely nothing. And in Mark's 16 chapters, by the end of chapter 14, the 12 disappear. They abandon Jesus, and Mark's gospel never, ever, ever shows them showing up again. There is the command by the young man at the tomb, go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. But according to Mark, the message never got through. So the very fact that we have, as Barb is pointing out, this chunk of material in which, yes, the 12 or the 11 are clearly there, and they have a role now. Now, if we look at the rest of Matthew's gospel, we're going to find that although the disciples wobble a lot in Matthew's gospel, their reputation is rehabilitated to a considerable extent in Matthew's gospel compared to Mark. The 12 struggle, but eventually they succeed. This is a dramatic turnaround from the way that Mark has presented the 12. And the ending of Matthew's gospel really picks this up in a strong way. Another observation that you have about changes, what these changes do to the story, to the meaning of Jesus' activity.
Well, you said that Mark treats the disciples like they're dumb.
Yes.
Is it the difference between the scholars, where Mark's maybe writing for people who aren't educated, and Matthew is looking at the teachers who are going to impart this to the people?
Okay, the question of why that difference. why do Matthew and Mark have a different view? Please note that for Mark's gospel, Mark's community apparently sees itself in danger of being exterminated. They have no expectation that they are going to be able to continue functioning. So to talk about, for Mark's gospel, to talk about some future activity, that's a little more precarious. And in particular, for Mark, the 12 are presented by Mark as embodying the values that are exactly contrary to Jesus. The 12 in Mark are interested in power, in prestige, in privilege for themselves. And from at least the author of the Gospel of Mark's perspective, there seems to be a critique that is going on of the 12. Now, that's a little hard for us to fathom, because we're accustomed to seeing the 12 as kind of role models, examples. They're fallible followers, but hey, if you hang in there, you can make it. But for Mark, no, there's something problematic from Mark. Now, were the 12 as stupid as Mark presents them? Probably not. But something was problematic, because we find Matthew, and we're going to find Luke, also having critiques of the 12. Matthew and Luke are going to soften the negative portrayal of the 12, but there are still problems. Mark has it's a literary technique for Mark to present opposition to Jesus among Jesus' own followers. And that may be reflecting certain things within Mark's own community, some real tensions within Mark's community compared to others. For example, the Apostle Paul has some really negative things to say about leaders of the church in Jerusalem, which included Cephas, Peter, and John, and James, the brother of Jesus. Those were the three key leaders of the church in Jerusalem. And Paul refers to them as the so-called pillars of the church. That's not a very positive thing. Mark's gospel seems to have been heavily influenced by Paul's perspective. And that may be what's going on here. No, to recognize that the gospel writers are not presenting us necessarily what really happened, but it's perspectives. And there were a variety of perspectives within the early church. Other kinds of observations that anyone either online or in the room. Michael.
I think the ancestry of Jesus was important. It ties it back to the Old Testament.
Okay. The idea of having a genealogy begin Jesus' ministry, or begin the story of Jesus, is important. And I'm going to shift over here for just a minute. Oops. Yeah. we have Matthew's gospel beginning with these words, an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Mark began, beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, or Messiah, Son of God. Matthew begins with a different expression and then follows a very stylized genealogy. A genealogy that is so stylized that we have this statement. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. That's really convenient. And for Matthew, there's a big point being made of this. And as Michael just pointed out, okay, this genealogy at the beginning ties Jesus to important figures in the past, to David, okay, Israel's greatest king, to Abraham, the ancestor of the Jewish people, to the deportation to Babylon, a hugely important event in the history of the Jewish people. And yes, for Matthew to begin this gospel with this recollection of figures and events from the past, that's a major mark of Matthew's gospel. We are going to find Matthew repeatedly emphasizing connections of Jesus to the Jewish scriptures. There are a whole series of things that are often called fulfillment quotations. This happened in order to fulfill that which was spoken by the prophet, and then it quotes a particular passage. Matthew has that all over the place, and far more so than any other gospel writer. So the connections with Judaism's past, that's really important. Why might Matthew want to deal with such a thing? Why would that be important? To
Prove to the Jews? To prove to the Jews
Okay.
who he is?
To prove to the Jews who Jesus is, and that's very often how Christians today will take this as proofs. But if we look at this series of things, it's not really presented as a set of proofs. And in fact, a lot of these fulfillment quotations deal with little diddly stuff in Jesus' ministry. Not big stuff at all. They're in Matthew's gospel. We don't find these quotations being used to say, therefore, Jesus is the Messiah. Instead, it's just connections. Now, is this trying to prove something, trying to demonstrate something about Jesus? Or another way of looking at that is to say, is this something that is really directed toward Matthew's own community? And something that Matthew's own community already thinks Jesus is the Messiah. They don't need to be shown that. There's nothing in Matthew's gospel that indicates that this is a missionary document to be used to hand out on street corners. Okay, that's not the way Gospels functioned. Everything had to be written out by hand. It was extremely expensive. Instead, it seems as though perhaps Matthew is saying, hey, the Jewish scriptures are worthwhile because they're connected in some way with Jesus. Now, think of the Copernican revolution, okay? Prior to Copernicus, people assuming that everything, the sun revolved around the earth. Copernicus said, no, you got that backwards. Okay, it's not that the sun revolves around the earth, but the earth revolves around the sun. I suggest that for Matthew, this is a very similar kind of thing. No, it's not that Jesus revolves around Torah. Jesus revolves around Jewish scriptures. And therefore, we take the Jewish scriptures and we prove something about Jesus. But rather, Matthew takes something that is at the heart of Matthew's own community, the significance of Jesus. And, Torah revolves around Jesus. The Jewish scriptures are valuable because, they're connected with Jesus, the one that we already accept and acknowledge, who's at the very center of things. What else? So is there someone online who wants to make an observation here?
Denny, not an observation, but a question.
Hang on, Paul, I've got a problem here with sound. Okay, Paula, can you speak again?
Now can you hear me? No, okay.
Still not hearing. Sorry.
Okay.
Let me.
Somebody
else who is online speak and see if it's a problem that I've got in terms of how I got my controls set here.
Can you hear me?
Oh, Ron, yeah, the problem is at my end. Hang on.
Speaker on.
Got that. Sorry. I've got the controls set here. I'm sorry. I'm not picking up sound from
That's okay.
sorry. Okay. There are other things here. Yes.
Well, when I started reading with the genealogy, the thing that struck me was that was a bloodline, but actually Jesus, wouldn't it have come through Mary because Joseph wasn't his bloodline?
Yeah.
Okay.
Technically, Jesus is not from David,
Yeah.
because it was Joseph who was from David, not Mary.
Right,
Unless
that's
Mary
what I
was
was
cousin.
Okay. This is a good observation that the genealogy explicitly says it's going through Joseph. Joseph is the one who is a descendant of David.
The house is on.
And that seems to be a problem. It's a problem, though, that Matthew seems to have already recognized. And one of the things that, if you watch very carefully what's happening in the birth story, which is all told from Joseph's perspective. Joseph does precisely what Judaism claims is the process for acknowledging a child as one's own. It's officially an adoption ceremony in which within Matthew's gospel, Joseph is the one who names Jesus. And by doing so, in Jewish tradition, that acknowledges that that person is part of Joseph's own line. That you properly recognized, Darlene and Rebecca, that there is a tension between the story of virginal conception and the genealogy. But Matthew has included has included something that responds specifically to that. By the way, if there are people in the online who want to use the chat window, that's one way of getting some questions coming in if you would like to do that. Okay, any other kinds of observations that you have? All right, let's take a look at a few other things here in terms of Matthew's whole story.
Well, it seems like he fills in the blanks. There's a lot of questions left in Mark that he fills in.
Can you say that again?
I said, it seems like he fills in the blanks. There's probably a lot of questions. He even might have had a lot of questions.
Okay.
And he filled in and made it all make sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, that Darlene's comment was that Matthew fills in things that might be questioned. In all likelihood, okay, our interest in filling in blanks, okay, for Matthew, okay, the story is being told for an overarching purpose, okay. There's something going on with Matthew's own audience. And Matthew tells the story of Jesus to try to address those particular concerns rather than just historical kinds of questions. Now, for example, picking up on this notion of the connection with Judaism. There is some really important material in Matthew that emphasizes the importance of Torah law. And when Matthew talks about law, when Matthew talks about Torah, Matthew is not talking about the 10 Commandments. Matthew is talking about the 613 commandments that Judaism traditionally has spoken of as being the number of commandments that the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, contain. With the commandments, okay, they're wide ranging. That's what defines who a Jew as a Jew is. Okay, someone who acknowledges the importance of all of God's law. And Jesus says, according to Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these 613 commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Matthew's community apparently sees itself as a Jewish community. And indeed, Matthew's gospel is probably the most Jewish of all of the gospels. It emphasizes these things over and over again. And yet it also includes some of the most harsh statements about Jews. This idea that, obeying Torah, fully obeying Torah, is an expectation that's really important. Please remember that, if Christian community obeys Torah fully, that means no baby back ribs. That means no shrimp, no lobster, because shellfish are forbidden. No combinations of meat and dairy, so no cheeseburgers. This is crucial. Whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Okay. This is important. And for Matthew's gospel, Matthew encourages his audience to obey Torah. And if Matthew's audience was being criticized by other Jews, that you're not really Jewish because you're putting a lot of emphasis on this Jesus guy. Matthew's gospel is saying, hey, we deal with Torah just the same as every other Jew does. That's a key part of who we are. In Matthew's gospel, right after that statement, we have a whole series of sayings that are called the Antitheses by many folks, which consist of a whole series of statements. You've heard that it was said, okay, and then quoting something from Jewish law, but I say to you, you've heard that it was said, but I say to you, you've heard that it was said, I say to you. And even more of those kinds of statements. In these statements, it is not a matter of Matthew presenting Jesus as greater than Torah, of getting rid of Torah, because, Jesus has just said, hey, you don't get rid of any of it. In order to make sense of this, if we pay attention to a practice within Judaism, we will recognize that Matthew presents Jesus doing precisely the same as other rabbis. There's a practice in Judaism that's known as building a fence around the Torah. If you have a particular Torah commandment, such as don't murder, don't kill, the rabbis would create another set of rules to be observed. And if you observe those rules, you will never be in a position of breaking that Torah commandment. And that seems to be precisely what Jesus is doing here. The rabbis would build a fence around the Torah. And, if you get to a point and you will obey that additional rule, you don't end up breaking Torah. Jesus deals with this kind of, the same kind of process that other rabbis presented. The command says, don't murder. The fence says, hey, don't nurse anger against another person. Hey, if you don't nurse anger against another person, no, chances are you're not going to end up killing a person. Don't commit adultery. That's the Torah command. Jesus says, don't look with lust at another person. If I don't treat another person as a sexual object, I'm unlikely to end up in bed with that person. Okay, that's how this series of antitheses works. It's not that Jesus is doing something contrary to Jewish law here, but rather he is doing exactly the same thing that other Jewish teachers do, which for Matthew and Matthew's community demonstrates that, hey, we're doing Jewish stuff just like those Jews who criticize us are doing. That's a rather significant kind of move. Matthew has a series of other kinds of fences around the Torah and of particular ways of thinking of Torah. In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. Hey, if you do that, frankly, that's going to prevent you from violating an awfully lot of Torah. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. You do that stuff, no, you're not going to end up violating Torah law. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Matthew is written at a point where the temple no longer exists. Matthew quotes this passage twice, and it's quoting a passage in the Hebrew Bible from the book of Hosea. Strikingly, we find that Jewish leaders, the rabbis, who were trying to come to terms with the destruction of the temple, they used exactly that same passage to emphasize how it would be possible to continue on with Judaism in the absence of a temple. Scripture had said, God desires mercy, not sacrifices. We can't do the sacrifices because there's no temple. Therefore, hey, we can still function as Jews. That was true for Matthew's Jewish community that emphasized following Jesus, and it fits the rest of Judaism as well. We are at the end of our time today. For next time, we're going to be dealing with the Gospel of Luke. And I would like you to do the same thing that for this next week that you were doing for this week. Please read the Gospel of Luke if you can. And note how Luke changes Luke's Mark source. Okay. Luke knows nothing about Matthew, but Luke makes use of Mark. Watch for the changes that occur there, and we will pick that up this next round. Thank you for being here today. A recording of this material will be available on the church website. Thank you.
Thank you.
Art, you're still online. Can you pop on, unmute yourself for a moment? I want to try something here. We're trying to see if I can fix things.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Sorry.
Me too.
Well, I still have that one, but I didn't do it as Christmas present. I ended up. Christmas present, more.
That's what I remember.
Friend of mine was having her first baby during a pandemic at the age of 42.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Yes, question. Oh, my goodness, that's a lot of work.